The fence post is cedar. I know that without looking, the way you know the weight of your own hand. 70 years of freeze and thaw have silvered it down to the grain, but it hasn't moved. I set it myself, drove it with a maul borrowed from the neighbor to the north, and I remember exactly how the ground sounded when the point broke through the frost line, a crack, like something giving up an argument. I stand here in October, the field gone the color of wheat straw, and I let the cold come in through my collar, the way cold always has in this county, without asking permission. The sky is the particular white of eastern Colorado in autumn, a white that isn't clouds and isn't clear, just the sky deciding not to commit. The grass bends north. It always bends north. I am an old man. That still surprises me, some mornings. But I have been here before. I have been 18 and standing in this same field with the ground still half frozen and the wind carrying grit off the county road, and 6 different men, in the space of 1 week, telling me a version of the same thing. Not cruelly, that's what I want you to understand. Not one of them was cruel about it. They were practical. They were the kind of men who had buried fathers and grandfathers and watched weather ruin good people, and they had learned to see the outcome before the season proved it. They looked at me, the dead man's grandson, 18 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too wide across the shoulders, and they did the arithmetic. They came up with the same number every time. 0. The spring I turned 18, 6 men told me I wouldn't last the season. That was March 1953. The ground was still iron under a 1/4 inch of thaw. My grandfather had died on the last day of February, a Saturday, just before dawn, and I had driven in from the school dormitory in Pueblo on borrowed gas money, and by the time I pulled the truck down the dirt road and saw the farmhouse with every window dark, I understood that the weight of this place had passed to me completely. No gradual transfer, no apprenticeship, just 74 acres of hay ground and pasture, and 1 collapsing north shed, and an old banknote due in October, and the John Deere in the machine shed that hadn't started clean since November. The field I'm standing in now was frozen mud that March morning. The brome was flat and brown and looked dead, the way brome always looks in early spring before it decides to come back. I didn't know yet whether it would come back. I didn't know yet what my grandfather had left me besides the land. I hadn't found the notebook. That came 3 days later, and it changed the shape of everything that followed. The morning after the funeral, I drove back out to the farm alone. The service had been at the Methodist Church in Carval. 40 minutes, a dozen people, folding chairs on cold linoleum, his neighbors. The grain elevator man, Ida from the post office, who stood in the back and didn't sing, but didn't leave either. After, someone pressed a covered dish into my hands, and someone else said something about the land that I didn't catch fully because I was already calculating how many miles of fence needed to be walked before the ground softened. I turned off the county road at the RR2 box and came down the 1/4 mile of dirt track as the sun was still low and orange behind me. The farmhouse looked exactly as it had looked the morning I arrived, every window dark, the porch railing leaning 10 degrees off plumb, but the light was different now, colder, more final. I got out of the truck, and I saw the north shed before I saw anything else. The roof had come down, not all the way, not a clean collapse, worse than that. The center beam had cracked under the weight of February snow, and the south half of the roof had punched inward and taken most of the east wall with it. Boards splayed outward like broken ribs. A rusted hay hook hung from what was left of a rafter, turning slowly in the wind. I walked over and stood at the edge of the wreckage and looked at it for a long time without moving. There was a fence stretcher under there somewhere, 2 rolls of wire, a harness I didn't have a horse for anyway. I went to the machine shed next. The John Deere sat where it always sat, against the north wall, engine cover greasy, the seat cracked through at the seam. I climbed up and turned the key, and the starter labored and ground and then went quiet. Frozen. I climbed back down and stood with my hands in my pockets, and looked at it the way you look at something when you're deciding whether to feel afraid or angry, and you settle on neither because neither will start the engine. Then I went to the kitchen door. The notice was tacked there with a single nail, a single sheet of paper folded once. First Territorial Bank of Lincoln County printed across the top in small hard type. I read it standing on the step in my coat. $880. Due in full, October 1st, 1953. I folded it along its original crease and put it in my inside pocket, next to my ribs where I'd feel it all day. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the field. Brown, flat, not yet decided whether it was dead or only waiting. A wind came across it with nothing to stop it for 40 miles. 7 months. A collapsed shed, a frozen tractor, and 19 acres that hadn't been asked anything yet. Dolph Mower came down the road on a Tuesday, 4 days after I found the bank notice. I heard his truck before I saw it, a '49 Ford with a loose heat shield that rattled on washboard, and I was already out of the barn by the time he pulled up. He was a big man, 61 years old, with a face like creek clay left to dry. He didn't get out right away. He sat with the engine running and looked at the north shed, the roof caved in a long diagonal crease where February's weight had finally won. Then he cut the engine and stepped down. He wasn't unkind. That's the thing I want to be honest about, even now. He shook my hand with both of his and asked how I was eating and whether the furnace was holding. He'd known my grandfather 20 years. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the hay ground, still brown, still flat. And he talked about the county, about the drought years coming, about what hay ground costs to plant, and what it doesn't always come back. He said he'd give me $400 for the 19 acres, said I could keep the house, keep the pasture, maybe run a few head of cattle if I wanted something to do. Said it was a fair price, and that he'd have the check in my hand before the week was out. I thanked him. I told him I'd think on it. He put his hat back on, and looked at me the way older men look at you when they've already made the decision they think you'll eventually arrive at. Then he drove back up the road, and the heat shield rattled until I couldn't hear it anymore. The co-op conversation was different. It was a Saturday, the feed store in Carval, the kind of place that smells like sacked grain and old rubber, and somebody's coffee left too long on the burner. I was there for a bolt that fit the pitman arm on the mower. The arm was cracked, and I'd been studying how to splint it with a steel sleeve before I could afford a real replacement. Wes Critchfield was at the counter with 2 other men I didn't know well, cattlemen from the north end of the county. He was 58 and wore his authority the way some men wear a good coat. Easy, like he'd had it so long he'd forgotten it was there. He looked at me when I walked in. I'd met him once at my grandfather's funeral. Briefly, in the cold outside the church. He said an 18-year-old, with no crew and no capital, had no business planting hay for market. Then he turned back to his coffee. Not angry. Not even dismissive in a way that suggested I'd earned his dismissal. Just concluded. As if I were a column of numbers that didn't add up. I bought the bolt. I drove home on the dirt road with the window cracked. The north shed had been a problem since February. The snow came heavy that winter, heavier than anyone expected for that part of the county, and the old shed's ridge beam split sometime in the night of the 14th, the whole east-facing slope of the roof pancaking down onto the grain crib underneath. I hadn't been inside since. There was too much else requiring my hands, and the shed wasn't urgent the way the mower was urgent, the way the lean was urgent. But I needed the space. The hay ground was thawing in patches, the soil working loose the way it does in late March, and I had to clear that crib if I wanted somewhere dry to stage the small equipment before the real work started. I went at it on a Tuesday, the 24th of March, cold morning, the kind where your breath comes out in long, thin ropes. I pulled the collapsed roofing off in sections with a pry bar and my hands, stacking the warped boards to one side. The crib itself was mostly intact. The roof had come down at an angle, punching through the back wall but leaving the front structure standing. I worked for 2 hours before I got to the interior. There was the usual ruin of a neglected outbuilding. Broken tack, a rusted cultivator tooth, a coffee can packed solid with washers, and against the back wall, half buried under a section of fallen rafter and a burlap sack so rotted it came apart when I touched it, a tin box, rectangular, maybe 10 inches long. Someone had run a bead of solder around the seam of the lid, not factory work but careful handwork, the kind a person does when they mean for something to stay dry. I knew my grandfather's hands. I knew what he considered worth keeping. I brought it inside before I opened it. The solder gave way with a kitchen knife and some patience. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had done its job, was a notebook, water-stained on the cover despite everything, the leather soft and dark as old bark, 4.5 inches by 6. His name on the inside cover in the cramped pencil hand I recognized from the seed invoices he'd kept in the kitchen drawer. I lit the kerosene lamp at the table and I read it that night, cover to cover, not stopping. He had started writing it in 1934. The drought years, the years when this county turned to powder and blew east. He'd lost one hay crop completely, a second one to wind, and then he had started watching the land instead of fighting it. The notebook was his watching written down, furrow spacings, timing of shallow cultivation to hold surface moisture, a hand-drawn map of the property showing which way the subsurface water ran and where it slowed. He had already done this. 19 years before I was standing in his kitchen, he had already figured out how to grow hay on dry ground. He just needed someone patient enough to find where he'd left the answer. I read it twice more before the lamp burned low. Then I folded the oilcloth back around it, set it beside the salt shaker, and went to bed. Not because I wasn't thinking about it, because I was thinking about it too hard, and I knew the kind of decisions you make at 2 in the morning, with your heart going fast, are the kind you regret at noon. In the morning I walked the 19 acres before breakfast. The ground was still February hard at the surface, iron gray where the frost hadn't fully come out, but I crouched down and worked a handful loose from about 4 inches deep, and it was darker, holding something. Not much, but something. I looked at the slope of the field, northwest to southeast, just like the hand-drawn map showed, and I could see what he had seen, where the moisture crept slow and stayed, where you'd want the furrows running cross-slope to catch it, instead of letting it slide off. I went back inside and ate, and then I started. The ground needed to be worked before it sealed up again in the dry wind that would come in March. The furrow spacings in the notebook were specific, not guesses, not approximations, but the product of 4 years of watching and adjusting, written out in a hand that didn't waste words. 22 inches between furrows on the upper third of the field, 18 on the lower where the subsurface water slowed. I pasted out by hand the first day, laid chalkstone markers. The Model B started badly, coughing and refusing until the third pull, but it started. 2 men stopped their truck on the road and watched me work the first week of April. I knew who they were, neighbors from the west side, the kind who didn't wave, just observed. I didn't stop. I didn't look up more than once. Whatever they were saying to each other inside that cab, it wasn't encouragement. I could feel that much across 400 yards of open field. They drove on. My feed account at the post office was running short by mid-April. I'd been careful, but careful doesn't stretch what isn't there. I went in on a Tuesday to check the balance and settle what I could, and she, the woman behind the counter, gray-haired, who ran the feed ledger the way some people run a church, quietly and with authority, slid the account book across to me without a word. She had extended the account by $40. No note, no request for a signature, just the number written in her careful hand with the date beside it. I looked up at her. She had already gone back to sorting the afternoon mail. I don't know if she believed in me, or if she just believed in the land and figured somebody had to work it. Either way, that $40 bought the seed I needed to finish the planting, and I went back out and finished it. The mower had been my grandfather's worry before it was mine. I'd found a note about it tucked inside the back cover of his notebook. Just 3 words in pencil. Pitman Arm Watch. I'd read it in February without knowing what it meant. By May, I understood. The cracking started on a Thursday morning, the 8th of May, when I dropped the sickle bar into the first cut of the season. Not a full break, just a sound, a dry tick beneath the blade chatter, like a knuckle popping wrong. I ran 2 more passes and told myself it was nothing. On the 3rd pass it went. The arm sheared at the stress point, the blade locked, and the whole mower lurched sideways behind the tractor like a thrown shoe. I shut down the engine and sat there in the sudden quiet listening to the meadowlarks, which had not paused for any of it. 3 days, that's what it cost me. I pulled the arm myself and drove the 44 miles to Limon in the truck, with the broken piece wrapped in a burlap sack on the passenger seat. The salvage dealer there was a lean man with grease under every fingernail who kept a barn full of stripped implement parts, organized in a system only he could read. He found me a match in 40 minutes. A used arm off a 1939 McCormick bar that he said would fit close enough if I was willing to do the machine work. $22. I had 26 in my coat pocket and owed 17 of that to the feed co-op by the end of the month. I drove home and did not stop to eat. I set up in the barn by lantern light that same evening because I couldn't afford to lose the next day. The fitting took longer than I expected. The bolt pattern was off by 1/8 of an inch on one side, and I had to drill it out carefully, by hand, in the dim orange light, checking the alignment twice before every cut because there was no margin for a mistake I couldn't undo. Sometime past midnight, I dropped the file and didn't pick it up immediately. I just sat on the stool with my hands in my lap and looked at the half-finished arm clamped in the vise. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid in that moment. I was. Not of the work. I knew the work. Afraid of the arithmetic. Afraid of what one more lost day in the field meant against what the sky was already doing to the county that spring. But the fear didn't last long. Something changed in the barn around that hour, and I'm not sure I can name it exactly. The doubt didn't leave. It just stopped being loud. It settled into the back of the room and got quiet, and what was left in front of me was only the arm in the vise and the next thing to do. I picked up the file. I finished the Pitman arm on a Thursday morning, installed it before the dew had burned off the grass, and by 10 o'clock I was cutting again. The mower sang clean through the first pass. No chatter, no wobble, just the clean percussion of the blade through the stems, and the smell of cut brome rising off the ground the way it does when the plant is still holding moisture. That was the last moisture anything held for a long while. June came in warm and stayed that way. The first week brought clouds, real clouds, the kind that built up over the mountains in the afternoon and moved east with a serious look about them. I watched them from the seat of the tractor, read their color, the way my grandfather's notebook described, the blue-gray underside, that means business, the flat-bottomed ones that are only passing through. These were flat-bottomed. They moved over the county like men in a hurry and left nothing behind except the sound of wind and a particular kind of disappointed silence that open country makes when rain doesn't come. 2 days of that. 2 days of clouds, and nothing under them. To my north, I could see the county ditch glinting where my neighbor had the headgate open, running water down the broad furrows of his field in long silver lines. He had the water rights and the acreage and the agreements that went back 30 years. His operation drank while the sky teased, and that was simply how it was. I didn't begrudge him that. But I watched, and I noted, and I went back to what I had. In the evenings, after the tractor hours were done, I walked the rows by hand with a long-handled hoe and a folded page from the notebook tucked in my shirt pocket. The timing chart, recopied in my own hand because I was afraid the original would fall apart from handling. The chart was specific in a way that felt almost unreasonable until I understood the logic behind it. It told me not just where to break the soil, but when, which hour of the morning, how many days after the last work, how deep to keep the dust mulch that sealed the moisture underneath. My grandfather had learned it by failure first, same as everything else worth knowing. He'd recorded the failures just as carefully as the successes, which is why I trusted him. The grass didn't announce itself. It just began, quietly, to hold a color that the road watchers, the men who slowed their pickups on the county route without stopping, did not seem to expect. Not lush, not the fat green of an irrigated field. Something subtler than that. A steadiness, a deepened tone that said the roots had found something and were holding on. I don't think anyone understood what they were seeing yet. I barely understood it myself, but I kept following the charts, evening by evening, row by row, and the color held. July came in like a door slamming shut. The first week brought no rain. I told myself that wasn't unusual. Dry spells ran through July, the way cracks run through old plaster. Expected, unremarkable. The second week brought no rain either, and the air changed quality. It stopped feeling like air that might eventually do something, and started feeling like air that had already decided. The sky went the color of old bone and stayed there. The dust on the road didn't settle between vehicles anymore. It just hung. I watched the thermometer on the north side of the barn hit 103 on a Tuesday and stay above 98 through the following Saturday night. By mid-month, the big fields to the north were showing it. Not dramatically at first, just a yellowing at the margins, the way a paper scorches before it catches. But the margins widened. A week later I could see from the ridge road that my neighbor's first cutting was past saving. The stems had gone brittle before the heads matured. He'd put that field up in late June and been watching it fatten toward a second cut, and now it was finished. I didn't look long. It wasn't my business to stare at another man's loss. The month logged a total of 0.31 inches of rainfall. I know that number precisely because I recorded it myself in the same notebook where I recorded the furrow timings and the dust mulch depths. The county figure matched mine almost exactly, 31 hundredths, less than a finger's width if you cupped your palm and let it rain into it. In eastern Colorado in July, that's not a dry spell, that's a sentence. And my 19 acres stood green. Not a lush green, not a green you'd paint on a calendar, but green, unmistakably, stubbornly green, against a county that had gone the color of a paper bag. The subsurface slope my grandfather had mapped in 1934 was still doing what he said it would, holding moisture 6 inches down, wicking it upward slowly enough that the roots had learned to reach for it. The brome and the bluestem don't give up easily when they can find water. They just go quiet and keep working. I began to notice the trucks slowing more often. Not stopping, nobody stopped, but slowing. Men who hadn't looked twice at this place in spring were looking now. You could see them calculating without wanting to be seen doing it. There was nothing to argue with anymore. The eye doesn't lie. Brown ground and green ground don't need an explanation. The co-op chairman had made a remark to my face in March. I had not forgotten it, but I was not thinking about it then. I was thinking about the baler I still needed to borrow, the cracked pitman arm I'd already repaired twice, and whether the windrow I'd laid on the south quarter would cure properly before the next pass. The hay still had to come off the field. The baler came off the Danvers Co-op flatbed on a Tuesday morning, third week of July. The man who dropped it said he needed it back by the following Tuesday at the latest. Another outfit had it reserved. 7 days. I walked around it once, checked the knotter mechanisms, the tension on the twine, the pickup fingers. One finger was bent, and I straightened it against the drawbar before he'd pulled a quarter-mile down the road. I started that afternoon, and I did not stop for weather because there was no weather. That was the point. That was the whole summer in one sentence. No weather. The sky stayed white and indifferent, and the cut hay dried faster than I'd ever seen hay dry, which was a mercy, because I was moving on a clock I couldn't negotiate with. 4 in the morning, I was running the tractor by lantern light until the sky grayed enough to see the windrows. 9, 10 at night, still baling, the knotter throwing twine in the dark, the bales dropping clean and tight onto the carrier. I ate standing up. I slept 4 hours, sometimes 3. The water I drank from the hand pump between passes tasted like iron, and I didn't care. By Friday, I had 211 bales on the ground. By Sunday evening, 320. Monday, I finished the north field and the lower south strip and stacked the last bale, 340, brome and blue stem, stacked in rows 8 high in the north field, and I sat down on the ground next to the tractor and did not move for a while. The neighbor to the north had been driving past every day that week. I'd noticed his truck slow each time at the section line. On Tuesday morning, when the baler was already loaded back on the co-op truck heading west, I heard his engine stop at my fence. I walked out to him. He was standing at the fence line with his arms folded across the top rail, looking at the stacked rows. Not at me, at the rows. His mouth was closed. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to have to do. I stood beside him, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. He had come to this fence in March with advice. He had come in April with a softer version of the same advice. He had come in May and not said the word sell, but let the silence do the work. He was not advising now. He was just looking at the hay. 340 bales of it, stacked clean and tight in the July heat, on ground he had believed in March would not grow enough to matter. Dolph stayed at that fence for another minute, then got in his truck and drove north without a word. I watched the dust settle behind him and went back to work. Wednesday came in clear and still. No wind at all, which was unusual for August. I was in the barn checking the sickle bar when I heard a car on the dirt road. Not a farm truck, something heavier, with a quieter engine. I came out into the light and saw a dark green Buick pulling into the yard. The man who got out was wearing a collared shirt and good trousers, and he was holding his hat with both hands in front of him. I recognized him from March. He had been the one who spoke last that day, the one who waited until the others had finished and then said what all of them had been thinking, that the boy ought to be practical about this. He was 58 years old, and he had been running the co-op longer than I had been alive. He looked at the field before he looked at me, then he looked at me. I waited. He said the co-op had a situation. He said July had been harder on the county's feedstock than anyone had projected. He said several of his members were going to come up short before October. He said he had driven by the Rudder place twice in the past week, and he wanted to ask about the hay. I told him I had 340 bales of mixed brome and blue stem, field cured and stacked, and that I would sell the lot as a single purchase or not at all. He nodded. Then he asked what I was asking. $4.20 a bale. He looked at me. The county average was running closer to $3.80. We both knew that. He started to say something about the market, and I let him say it, and when he finished, I told him the price was $4.20. There was a silence that lasted long enough that a meadowlark started and finished its call somewhere out in the pasture. He said that was a hard number. I told him the hay was there and the drought wasn't over. He put his hat on the hood of the Buick. He looked at the field again, then he took a small notebook from his shirt pocket, not so different from the one I had been reading all spring, and uncapped a pen. He asked if I had a flat surface. I walked around to the hood beside him, and he wrote the purchase order out against the warm green metal, line by line, in a slow, careful hand. He did not negotiate further. He just wrote. He wrote the total at the bottom, 340 bales at $4.20. He did the arithmetic in the margin, crossed it once, wrote it again, $1,428. He tore the sheet carefully along the notebook's perforation, folded it once, and handed it across the hood of the Buick without ceremony. I put it in my shirt pocket. We shook hands. He drove back down the dirt road the way he'd come, and I stood in the yard until the dust settled. I drove into Carval that same afternoon. The post office was quiet. The old woman behind the counter had the account ledger open before I was fully through the door, as though she had been expecting me at roughly that hour on roughly that day. She did not say much. She asked to see the purchase order, looked at the total, and made an entry in her ledger in the same unhurried hand she used for everything else: feed accounts, seed invoices, the mail log she kept by hand because she did not trust the county's printed forms. She initialed it, stamped it, and slid the carbon copy back across the counter. She had already set aside a page for me. I could see my name at the top, written before I arrived. I thanked her. She told me to drive careful. The bank was 22 miles west, just past the county line in Limon. I got there before 4. The loan officer was a thin man in a brown suit who had told me in early March, when I came in to ask about the lien terms, that I should think seriously about my options. He had not said it unkindly. He had said it the way a man says something he believes is true and useful and kind all at once. I had not forgotten the exact phrase. I laid the purchase order on his desk and told him I wanted to retire the note in full. He looked at the paper. He picked up a pen and began filling out the release form. The whole transaction took 11 minutes. He did not meet my eyes once during those 11 minutes. Not when he confirmed the amount, not when he stamped the lien release, not when he slid the receipt across the desk. I did not need him to. I folded the lien release into the same pocket as the carbon copy from the post office and walked back out through the glass door into the afternoon heat. The truck was parked in the gravel lot. The engine turned over on the second try. I sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, looking at nothing in particular. Then I drove home. That was in late August. The leaves on the cottonwood along the fence line would not turn for another 6 weeks. I am walking that same field now. The cottonwood is still there, bigger by 50 years of rings, the bark gone to deep furrows, and the fence line, Dolph helped me reset, runs straight from the northwest corner post to the county road, straight as a man can sight it with one eye shut. The grass is brown at the tips. Autumn does that here. It pulls the color down into the roots and holds it there until spring, when nobody is watching, and then it comes back. I stop at the corner post, put my hand on it. The wood is not the same wood. That post is long since replaced again after that, but it sits in the same hole, the same corner, the same 6 miles east of Carval, on a dirt road with no name. RR2, Box 14. I still know the box number. Some things you do not have to try to remember. The notebook is still in the house, still in the same tin, the same shelf, the same corner of the kitchen where the light is best in the morning. The leather is drier now. The pencil marks have faded to almost nothing in a few places. I have not recopied them. It seemed wrong to transfer them into a cleaner hand. They belong in the cramped, careful script of a man who sat down after supper in 1934 and wrote what he had learned that day about water and soil and time, so that someone after him might not have to learn it from scratch. I am that someone. I was, anyway. Whether there is another one after me, I do not know. That is not mine to answer. Here is what I will tell you. Every farm, every old place, every barn with a door that sticks and a loft nobody has climbed in 30 years has something in it. A notebook, a ledger, a letter in an envelope tucked inside a book nobody reads anymore. A name carved into a handle. A map drawn by someone who knew the land better than any deed describes it. The older men will tell you it is nothing. They will say the old ways are gone, the old tools are worthless, the old fields are played out. Sometimes they are right, but sometimes they are wrong. And the only way to know is to go up into the loft and look. The field is still mine. If any part of this stayed with you, if you have a barn of your own, or a notebook you found in someone's drawer, or a story about being told you were too young, leave it below. I would like to hear it.